Jericho pulled on the reins, his eyes stopping when he noticed something dangling between the wooden beams. He dismounted and walked slowly forward. Then his heart nearly stopped. 4 women were hanging upside down, their ankles tightly bound with thick ropes, their entire bodies swaying in the cold wind. The blood had rushed to their heads, turning their skin a deep purple. Their hair hung down, covering their faces, making them look like upside-down ghosts guarding the gate to his home. Right next to them, a wooden sign had been nailed straight into the gatepost. Land already owned, Morrison. Jericho gripped the gun at his side, his breathing growing heavier. It felt like he had stepped into the devil's domain. But when he crouched down to check each one, his fingers touched flesh that was still warm, still faintly trembling. They were still alive. Alive in the most fragile, miraculous way, like candles on the verge of burning out. Without hesitation, Jericho pulled out his knife, cutting through each rope, catching each limp body as it dropped from the hooks. He squared his shoulders to carry the weight of 4 lives nearly snuffed out, and had no idea that this act of mercy would drag him into a war even more brutal than the one he had barely survived. Jericho Hale carried the first woman into the old wooden cabin. The door groaned as it opened, as if protesting the return of its rightful owner. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, ash, and rotting wood, but Jericho had no time to care. 4 half-dead bodies were still out there, and they needed him now. He laid the woman down on the wooden floor and quickly lit a fire in the hearth. As the blackened coals caught flame, a warm light spread through the room, pushing back the deadly chill in the air. Jericho returned to the gate and lifted the second woman. She felt almost weightless, just bones and skin, her body so ravaged it was barely holding on to life. He squared his shoulders and carried each woman into the cabin, as if lifting ghosts stripped of their dignity. By the time he reached the 4th, his arms were numb and his breath was short, but he did not stop. Once they were all laid out around the fire, he knelt beside them and began checking each one with the same hands that had once saved comrades on the battlefield. The first, her pulse was weak but steady. The second, red hair tangled like a flame just snuffed out. Her breath was shallow, her body stiff with pain. The third, her hands were ice cold, as if the smallest breeze could carry her away. And the last, her eyes shut tight, but between her arms was a leather crossbody bag. She was still clutching it, even after being strung up like that. Jericho noticed right away. She was holding something important. Something very important. He ran to get a basin of water, soaked a cloth, and gently wiped the rope marks from each bruised face. He massaged their arms and legs to get the blood flowing again. Hot tears slid down the cheeks of Eleanor the blonde when he slowly pulled her hands from their cramped position. "Hang in there. You are safe now," Jericho whispered, though he was not sure if this cabin was truly safe. The redhead twitched, then burst into a dry, hacking cough, dragging the last of her despair from deep inside. Her body shook uncontrollably. Jericho quickly raised a cup of warm water to her lips. As the warmth filled the cabin, the women began to stir, each at their own pace. The first eyes to open were Maribel's black hair, a stare sharp as a blade. She tried to sit up, but Jericho gently pressed a hand to her shoulder. "You are all right. My name is Jericho Hale. I found you at the gate." Maribel let out a rough breath, her voice hoarse. You should not be here, Morrison. He is going to come back." Jericho paused, his eyes narrowing as that old warrior instinct flared inside him. "I am not going anywhere," he said. "But right now, you need to stay alive." The others drifted in and out of consciousness, like their souls were struggling to return to the world. When the last one, Juniper, cracked her eyes open, still gripping the leather bag, she whispered something that froze the air in the room. What is in here is what he fears most. Jericho looked at the worn leather bag. He did not know what was inside, but he understood one thing. Tonight, evil had shown its face, and he had unknowingly chosen to stand with the ones it hunted, and that choice would change everything. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its gentle popping echoing through the room, casting flickering light on 4 faces that had just crossed the line between life and death. The bruises on their wrists and ankles were still raw, the smell of scorched rope clinging to their hair. Jericho sat down on a low wooden chair, his back against the cabin wall. No one spoke for several minutes. Pain and fear thickened the air like smoke, until Maribel, the black-haired woman, the natural leader of the group, finally broke the silence. She pushed herself upright, her cold, sharp gaze locking onto Jericho. We were not robbed, and we were not kidnapped. We were executed. Jericho frowned. Executed? Rosalind, the redhead, let out a bitter, broken laugh, doubling over from the pain. That is right. Morrison wanted us strung up like wolves caught raiding livestock. A message to the whole town. Defy him and die. Jericho felt heat rise in his temples. Judge Morrison, he had always been rumored to rule with a heavy hand, but what he was hearing now reeked of something more savage. A beast in a judge's robe. Grace, with deep brown hair, the oldest among them, spoke next, her voice calm but filled with restrained anger. He did not just steal land. He turned the law into a whip. Anyone who refused to bow, he would invent a debt they could never repay. Eleanor, the blonde, still curled beneath a blanket, added with a trembling voice, "My father, he was just late on his winter tax." Morrison quadrupled the amount. Then came the fees, then the interest, and then he took our home. She covered her face, sobbing. He died the night we were thrown out. Morrison called it an accident, but we know the truth. He wants every poor woman to become his property. Rosalind clenched her fists, her voice sharp with fury. We formed a group, a secret one. We started collecting fake debt records. We were investigating his trafficking ring. And she turned to Juniper. Morrison's wife did not disappear because she ran away. Juniper, who had been silent until now, opened the leather bag and placed its contents on the table. A stack of documents, copies of debt ledgers, lists of missing persons, and a sealed envelope. "This," Juniper said, her voice heavy with time, "is from Nora Beckett, the court clerk, the only one who still had a conscience." Maribel nodded. She knew everything. Morrison locked her up to silence her. Jericho stared at the sealed envelope. Morrison's name was stamped across every page. These documents, they could bury a judge. Juniper continued. Nora managed to escape, but she was badly wounded. She gave us her full testimony and asked us to get it to the federal government. Grace clasped her hands tightly together, and that very night, Morrison found us. Rosalind spat hard onto the floor. He did not kill us right away. He strung us up at your grandfather's gate, like he wanted to claim the land first, then kill us later. Jericho clenched his jaw. The cabin fell into a heavy silence. One thing was crystal clear. They were not just victims. They were holding the very thing that could burn Morrison's entire empire to the ground. And from the moment they opened their eyes, Jericho had been pulled straight into the heart of the storm. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the cracks in the door like the weeping of the ancient forest. Jericho's grandfather's old cabin stood in the thick darkness, a tiny wooden box on the verge of being swallowed whole. But inside, 4 women and Jericho were turning it into a fortress. Maribel slowly stood up, her legs still trembling after hours of hanging upside down, but her gaze was as sharp as ever. "We do not have much time. Morrison will be back before sunrise." Rosalind, the redhead, slammed her hand down on the wooden table. "I swear he will pay. Tonight. His blood will stain this land." Grace pulled Rosalind back into her seat, her voice soft but firm. "This is not revenge, Rose. This is survival. If he comes, we survive." Juniper silently checked the leather bag again, treating it like a sacred relic. Jericho glanced over and asked, "Is there anything in the bag besides the documents?" Juniper replied, "There is something Nora Beckett gave us, and said only to use it if there was no way out." Jericho asked no further. He understood tonight was no longer just about survival. It was a battle between light and darkness. They got to work. Maribel propped up furniture tables, crates, even the storage cabinet to barricade the windows and front door. Rosalind grabbed kerosene and poured it into empty liquor bottles, wrapping them with cloth to make firebombs. Grace checked their ammunition, only 3 usable guns, along with Jericho's grandfather's hunting knife and old axe. Eleanor, though her hands were still trembling, gathered water, bandages, and ointment into a corner they turned into a makeshift infirmary. Jericho stood alone at the door, looking out into the vast darkness. Beneath the black sky, he could hear faint echoes from the war years. He had once fought for strangers, for distant orders. But this time, he was fighting for the people breathing right beside him. He turned back and said, "You could still escape. There is a trail over the ridge behind the mountain. I will hold him off." Maribel stepped up and looked him dead in the eye. "We have been running our whole lives, Jericho. This time, we stand." Rosalind lifted her chin. "And if Morrison comes, he will have to face all 5 of us." Jericho pressed his lips together. There was something burning in their eyes, something he had never seen on the battlefield. A will to live that burned brighter than fear. By midnight, the cabin was nearly ready. Firelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows on the wall like warriors out of legend. Eleanor looked at Jericho and asked softly, "Do you believe we will make it out of this alive?" Jericho rested his hand on his grandfather's old Winchester rifle. His voice was calm but steady. "I believe this. If Morrison sets foot on my grandfather's land, he will have to go through us first." Out there, deep in the wilderness, came the sound of hooves, distant but clear. 1, then 2, then more. Maribel gripped her gun tightly. "They are coming." Jericho took a deep breath. The storm was arriving sooner than he expected, and that night, his grandfather's cabin was about to become a battlefield. Thank you for being here with me. Let us know where in the world you are listening from. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel to support my work. I truly wish you peace and happiness, wherever in the world you are hearing this. The sky had not yet turned to day, but streaks of red from the coming dawn had already begun to cut faint lines across the cold gray horizon. Jericho stood by the window, eyes narrowed. A heavy sound rumbled from the distance, the pounding of hooves, not just one, but dozens. Maribel leaned in close to his shoulder, her voice barely more than a breath. "How many?" Jericho answered without blinking. "At least 30. Then they appeared, 30 of Morrison's gunmen, lined up across the hillside. The red light of dawn glinted off their rifles, each one shining like steel teeth. In the center, riding a massive black horse as wild and fierce as the man himself, was Morrison. He wore an old judge's hat, but the face beneath it was pure predator. He tossed away a cigar, crushed it under his boot, and shouted, "Jericho Hale, I am giving you one last chance. Bring those 4 women out, or I will burn your grandfather's damn shack to the ground with them inside it." Rosalind let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Call it a cabin, you bastard. The only shack here is that rotting brain of yours." Jericho pulled her back before she exposed herself at the window. He shouted back, "This is my family's land, and no one steps through that door without leaving their blood in the dirt." Morrison curled his lip into a wicked grin. "Good. Let us see how tough that mouth is when your cabin turns into a coffin." He raised his hand. That was the signal. Gunfire erupted like thunder. Bullets tore into the wooden walls, blasting splinters across the room. Maribel and Grace rolled into their prepared positions, and Jericho's grandfather's old rifle cracked first. One of Morrison's gunmen took a round to the neck and dropped like a sack of grain. Rosalind rushed to the back door and hurled a Molotov cocktail. The flaming bottle smashed into the brush, lighting up a long wall of fire that cut off half of the enemy's right flank. Eleanor screamed as she struggled to reload with shaking hands, but she did not run. No one inside the cabin ran. Jericho dove to the opposite window, taking careful aim, each shot carrying the precision of a man who had lived in the trenches. A gunman darted toward a pine tree. Jericho dropped him before he could finish reloading. Outside, Morrison roared like a madman. "Idiots! Put out that fire and push forward. It is just one rotten cabin." But Jericho's grandfather's cabin was not rotten. It had become a death trap. One of the thugs charged the front door and kicked it with full force just as Juniper pulled a tripwire. A heavy plank spiked with nails swung down like a forest snare, striking the man square in the throat. He collapsed on the steps, blood spraying in arcs. Inside the cabin, harsh breaths blended with gunfire. Outside, fire, smoke, and the screams of the wounded echoed through the forest. Jericho gritted his teeth. "There are a lot of them," Maribel replied without lifting her eye from the scope. "And we are not easy to erase." The battle had begun, one tiny cabin against 30 cold-blooded killers. No one backed down, and Jericho knew if this cabin had once been his grandfather's home, then today it would become the grave for anyone foolish enough to cross its threshold. Thick smoke from the gunfire blanketed the front of the cabin like a black curtain drawn straight from hell. Cries of pain mixed with Morrison's barking orders echoed across the hillside. But inside that chaos, within the cabin walls, there was a strange stillness like time itself had slowed, giving them just one breath to catch. Jericho reloaded, sweat mixing with wood dust on his forehead. "They are not going to retreat," he said. "Morrison will never take a loss in front of his own men." Maribel exhaled sharply. "Then we make him understand he is fighting a battle he cannot win." Juniper stood, clutching the leather bag to her chest. Her eyes no longer trembled like when she first woke. Now they were like two thin blades, sharpened by the kind of resolve that would rather die than let the truth be buried. "It is time," she said softly. Jericho frowned. "Time for what?" Juniper opened the bag. Inside, along with fake debt records, lists of the missing, and land fraud files, was a large envelope sealed with wax. She placed it on the wooden table. Nora Beckett's testimony. Rosalind's eyes widened. "Nora? She is alive?" "I thought." "No," Juniper interrupted, her voice thick with grief. "She is dead." Morrison silenced her by sending her to treatment, a place no one ever comes back from. She opened the envelope. Inside were pages of shaky handwriting, but each word was as clear and sharp as a blade. "If you are reading this, I am dead. And the man who killed me is Judge Lucas Morrison. I was his court clerk. I saw him falsify debts, hide crimes, and traffic women. He killed his own wife when she discovered the real ledgers. I know the truth, and he knows I know." Grace gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles went white. "Dear God, this is the final blow." Maribel nodded and turned to Jericho. "You kept us alive tonight, not just with bullets, but with this." Jericho stared at the stack of papers in Juniper's hands. It was not just evidence, it was the final voice of a woman murdered for trying to bring justice. He spoke, his voice low and steady like the swing of an axe. "Let him see it." Rosalind's eyes snapped wide. "What? Show it to Morrison?" "Yes," Jericho replied. "He needs to see that his empire is already rotting from the inside, and he cannot kill the truth with a gun." Jericho hurled the envelope through a bullet-torn gap in the window. It landed right at Morrison's feet. He had just been shouting to burn the cabin when he caught sight of his own name written in Nora's unmistakable handwriting. The woman he believed had taken all her secrets to the grave. Morrison went pale. He ripped the envelope open, his eyes darting over each line like sledgehammers were striking his chest. No, this is not possible," he muttered. Some of the gunmen near him caught glimpses of the pages. Their faces went pale. One soldier asked cautiously, "Sir, is this true?" Morrison screamed, "Shut your mouth," but it was too late. Doubt, fear, and betrayal spread like wildfire. A few men stepped back. Some broke formation entirely. Juniper watched it unfold, whispering, "Nora, you struck him right in the heart." Jericho stood and looked out through the cracked wood. "Let him rot from the inside. We just need to hold a little longer." The cabin shook again as another wave of gunfire crashed into it. The truth had rattled Morrison, but there was still madness in him, more than enough to keep the violence burning. And Jericho knew the real storm had yet to come. Outside the cabin, the gunfire began to fade, not because Morrison ordered it to stop, but because panic had begun to spread through his ranks. Some of the men had read enough of the testimony to realize Morrison was no judge. He was no protector of the law. He was a beast in a robe of authority, willing to kill anyone who knew too much. One soldier turned to the man beside him, voice trembling. "We've been following a man who killed his own wife?" Another shook his head. "I am not dying for him. Not today." Morrison saw the cracks forming his fury, now more rabid than a cornered wolf. He drew his gun and pointed it directly at the man who had spoken, screaming like a madman. "Anyone who turns back, I'll shoot you myself." Several of his men lost heart and ran. Morrison fired. One dropped instantly, dead. Rosalind, watching through the window, gasped, "Dear God, he's shooting his own men." Grace gripped the handle of her knife. A demon biting its own limbs. That's when it's weakest. Jericho understood instantly. He was losing control, and this was the moment to end the siege. Jericho unlatched the back door and signaled to Maribel, "I'll draw their fire." When he turns, you back me up. Maribel frowned. Jericho, that's not a plan. That's suicide. He answered with a look of iron resolve. I've walked through hell before. Once more won't scare me. Before anyone could protest, Jericho burst out the back door. Bullets screamed past his ears, kicking up dirt and gravel. He dove behind a large boulder, raised his grandfather's Winchester, and fired. Boom! One of Morrison's gunmen dropped. Morrison spun and aimed at Jericho. Show yourself, you son of a... Jericho said nothing. He moved like a ghost among the pine trees, every shot deliberate, every step calculated. Each time Morrison tried to advance, gunfire rang out from the cabin, Maribel or Roslyn covering Jericho's every move. Juniper, crouched by the window, clutched the last envelope, Morrison's fake debt records. She shouted into the chaos, "Lucas Morrison, we've got enough evidence to drag you to hell 3 times over." Morrison heard every word, roaring like a wounded beast. "Lies. I am the law." Jericho stepped out from behind the boulder, rifle raised and steady. "No. You're just a killer hiding behind the law." Morrison swung his gun toward Jericho. The entire forest held its breath. And then, Maribel fired from the window. The bullet hit Morrison in the shoulder, spinning him sideways and dropping him to the ground. He roared in rage, "I will." But before he could finish, the sound of galloping hooves thundered from the east. A group of riders burst through the trees, black coats billowing, badges glinting in the rising light. Federal agents, mounted federal marshals. One of them shouted, "Lucas Morrison, you are under arrest for crimes including murder, human trafficking, and document forgery." The agents tackled him into the mud, cuffing him before he could utter another word. His smug face twisted into despair. Eleanor broke down in tears, not from fear, but because justice had finally arrived in the place where it had been stolen for far too long. Rosalind slammed her fist against the cabin's post. Finally, he's on his knees where he belongs. Jericho let out a breath, exhausted, but his eyes were still sharp, just like when he first carried 4 women from the edge of death into this cabin. Morrison was dragged away, sinking into the mud like a rotting sack of garbage. No longer a judge, no longer a man of the law, just a shivering criminal pulled into the light. And as the federal convoy rode off, Jericho turned back to the cabin where 4 women stood, still trembling, but alive. It was not over, but for the first time in years, they knew they had won a battle, and it was the one that mattered most. The sun slowly rose over the mountains, its pale golden light spilling into the valley, like the land itself was finally allowed to breathe again after a night suffocated by violence and hatred. Jericho's grandfather's cabin still stood torn, riddled with bullet holes, scorched with gunpowder, but standing tall, just like the man who defended it. Jericho sat on the steps, his back against a wooden post. Sunlight brushed across his weary face. The long years of war, the memories he had buried deep, now felt lighter as he watched the 4 women step out of the cabin alive, upright, and free. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice quiet but full of emotion. You saved us, Jericho." He shook his head with a faint smile. "No. We saved each other." Rosalind planted her hands on her hips, her red hair catching fire in the sunlight. "To be honest, I thought you were out of your damn mind running out there to face them alone." Maribel, arms folded behind her back, still held her sharp expression, but her eyes had softened. "And thanks to that madness, we're all still here." Juniper slowly approached Jericho, placing the old leather bag on the wooden table outside. "I'll turn everything over to the federal agents. But this place," she glanced around, "deserves a second chance." That morning, they began cleaning the cabin not to forget what happened, but to prove they no longer feared it. Rosalind yanked broken wood from the window frame, cursing Morrison under her breath as she worked. Maribel replaced the door, hammering each nail with surprising strength for someone so lean. Eleanor gathered hay and splinters, pausing now and then to wipe away tears not from sadness, but from relief. Juniper reset the table, placing the leather bag on the bookshelf Jericho's grandfather once used for storing maps. Jericho stepped into the yard and lifted the old wooden sign that once hung above the door. Yesterday, Morrison had nailed over it, "This land is claimed, Morrison." Today, Jericho carved a new line into the wood, "Home of the survivors." Grace, the quietest among them, read the words and placed a hand on Jericho's shoulder. "Your grandfather would be proud. Jericho looked down at his hands, the hands of a soldier, of a man who had just stood against evil, and then looked over at the four women laughing together behind the cabin. Not just him, he said. I am, too. That afternoon, as sunlight touched the newly repaired wood, the cabin looked different. No longer a place where death once hung from the beams. No more the sound of rope brushing wood. It had become a home imperfect, but real. Maribel lit the stove for their first meal. Rosalind cracked open a bottle of whiskey. Eleanor placed wildflowers in an old vase. Juniper rehung the curtain at the window. Jericho stood among them for the first time in years, no longer a man lost in a vast and violent world. Here, among four women who had fought to their very last breath, he found a family, not bound by blood, but by the very noose that once tried to end them, and instead tied them together. And in the deep red glow of the setting sun, Jericho's grandfather's cabin began a new life, just like the people living inside it. My friends, there are people in this world who, no matter how much violence, injustice, or darkness life throws their way, still choose to stand tall. They do not choose safety. They do not choose silence. And they never turn their backs on the pain of the powerless. They choose justice even knowing that the road is paved with scars. Because for them, what is right is not just a law, it is a promise written into their hearts. And it is people like that who keep this world from falling into eternal night. It has been an honor to share this story with you. I truly hope that wherever you are safe, and you are happy. I love you all, my dear listeners of Wild West Storytelling. Tell me what you felt while listening to this story. Leave a comment below. Type the number 8 if you enjoyed this story. And do not forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales from the Wild West.